And to introduce the next session is Dr. Paul Yee.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Yee. I'm a PGY5 radiology resident here at Hopkins, as well as affiliate faculty at the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare, and director of the Radiology AI Lab. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. I'll be moderating the next panel. If I could ask our three speakers to come up, take a seat at the table, really appreciate it. So today our first session is called Institutional Initiatives for AI in Healthcare. What, why, how? And with all the excitement over AI and its potential to transform healthcare, academic institutions are a logical place to start developing out this technology to bring it from bench to bedside. So today we'll explore different approaches to such an effort and potential challenges to an institutional AI initiative. We'll start with brief talks from our guest panelists, and followed by a panel discussion with opportunity for Q&A from the audience. But before we introduce our speakers, I'd just like to get a sense of who we have in the audience today. Can I get a show of hands of who's from Hopkins Engineering? All right, that's a good number. How about Hopkins Medicine? All right, fantastic. And anyone not from Hopkins visiting? All right, awesome. So it looks like we've got a pretty diverse mix of people, both from institutions and disciplines, and I think this will be a great time. So on to introductions. Our first speaker seated at the right-hand side of the table is Dr. Anthony Costa. Dr. Costa is Director of Sinai Biodesign and Chief Operating Officer for AI Sinai at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, as well as Assistant Professor of Neurosurgery. During his graduate work at Purdue and postdoctoral work at Northwestern, he focused on computational physics and software engineering challenges, ambient ionization, and self-assembly processes. Since joining Mount Sinai, Dr. Costa has served as the founding director of Sinai Biodesign, as well as the chief operating officer for AI Sinai, two groups which are focused on a needs-based approach to the advancement of medicine through technology innovation in devices and machine intelligence. Dr. Costa's work has resulted in numerous peer-reviewed publications in journals like Nature Medicine, as well as collaborations with groups like Verily Life Sciences, formerly a division of Google X and now an independent subsidiary of the Alphabet Incorporation. So please welcome Dr. Costa, everyone. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Chang. He's co-director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence in Diagnostic Medicine at the University of California, Irvine, and an assistant professor in residence in radiology. Dr. Chang has a unique background as both a physician and a software engineer, which has allowed him to directly engage in algorithm development with both data scientists and machine learning experts, along with the intuition and perspective of a clinical radiologist. His work has resulted in numerous peer-reviewed publications and awards, including a first-place finish at the International 2016 Mackay Grand Challenge for Automated Analysis of Brain Tumors, the 2017 and 2018 American Society of Neuroradiology Cornelius G. Dyke Award for Best Scientific Research Project, and the 2018 to 2019 American Journal of Neuroradiology Lucian Levy Award for Best Original Manuscript. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chang. And then last but not least is Dr. Scott Zeger, who is John C. Malone Professor of Biostatistics here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He also has a joint appointment in the Department of Medicine. He is the university's co-director of Hopkins InHealth, the Johns Hopkins Precision Medicine Partnership with the University, Health System, and Applied Physics Laboratory. He conducts statistical research on regression analysis for correlated responses and on methods for precision medicine, and has particular expertise in understanding the effects of health on smoking and air pollution. Dr. Zeger's work has been recognized with several awards, including most recently an honorary doctorate from Lancaster University in England and the 2015 Carl Pearson Prize from the International Statistical Institute. So please welcome Dr. Zeger. And so we'll begin with some short talks from each of our speakers, and with that I'd like to welcome Dr. Anthony Costa to the stage.
Well, thanks very much for the very kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Paul, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I've been really excited about this symposium for some time, and now having met some of the participants, I'm really excited. I'm especially excited. I thought some of the comments earlier around this title, From Bench to Bedside, were somewhat prophetic because, I think that there's going to become a theme here today. I'm certainly going to drive this one home in my short presentation to sort of reverse this a little bit and think about bedside to bench as opposed to bench to bedside. Of course, we're here in this panel for the next hour and 15 minutes or so to talk about institutional initiatives, and I've been involved in a couple of institutional initiatives in and around innovation in healthcare, specifically in engineering and artificial intelligence, over the past few years at Mount Sinai. But I took the opportunity to sort of look back and see if I could find 2 or 3 examples of some things that are happening at Mount Sinai that really differentiate between them, and to find whether or not that could be a road to some interesting discussion, both during this talk, I hope, but certainly during the panel as well. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 different things. The first one is an institute-level initiative, and that'll be the quickest, and that's the one that's not in italics. I mean, it's the one I'm not going to focus on. And then 2 others. One in clinical operations, which I think is sort of maximally differentiated from institutional-level initiatives, at least at Mount Sinai. And then something that maybe sits in between, but that might be motivated in the same way that we motivate the work in, for example, clinical operations and the successes that those have. So very briefly, before I move on to those 2, I just want to mention the launch of our AI Center at Mount Sinai. This is a very significant initiative, but my role in this and the involvement that I've had have been in the Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Institute, which some of you are probably familiar with, the Translational Molecular Imaging Institute at Mount Sinai, which has been around for over 10 years and is now relaunching within the context of our Center for Artificial Intelligence, and specifically focusing on building out capacity in biomedical engineering, specifically in artificial intelligence and sensors, and augmented reality, mixed reality as well, where some of our labs have done a fair amount of work. So if you know this group, the Translational Molecular Imaging Institute, they're a very successful institute-level organization within Mount Sinai focusing on imaging and nanomedicine, and we're looking to build out expertise in artificial intelligence, next-generation medical device development, which I'll talk very briefly about today, as well as computer vision and augmented reality. When I think about the value of this kind of initiative, probably people are somewhat familiar with the scale of what we're doing here, but what you may not know if you're not intimately familiar with Mount Sinai is that we actually lack an undergraduate program as well as a STEM, traditional STEM field graduate program, including engineering. And so for us, building an institutional initiative generally scopes around building the kinds of critical mass in engineering and artificial intelligence, basic sciences talent, and concurrently building out training programs, both PhD, MD, and MD, PhD, to support the work in an otherwise standalone academic medical center primarily focused, or at least historically focused, around biomedical sciences. So this is really the motivation for us at this institute level, especially for a place like Mount Sinai, to stand up something like this. Now, in substantial contrast to the institute level academic work, I want to talk very briefly about our clinical data science team. And this is the one that I think is really differentiates itself from maybe what you think of as an institute level piece of work. And I just want to point out a couple of people. This is Robbie Freeman at the top left and Matt Levin. Robbie Freeman is the Vice President for Clinical Innovation at Mount Sinai, and Matt Levin is a former computer scientist turned cardiac anesthesiologist who directs much of the work. And then they have a collection of really deployment-focused, enterprise-focused DevOps, as well as computer scientists and other data science engineers that are focused on actual deployment of artificial intelligence, machine learning tools into the clinical ecosystem at Mount Sinai. And of course, we know that Hopkins has had a great amount of success in this space as well. So they're responsible for a machine learning platform that lives very, very close to our medical record system. In our case, it's Epic. and to extract and build a centralized data interface that extracts data streams from Epic and pushes appropriate predictive analytics back into the Epic data stream, and then also pushes that to our clinical staff that are on the ground floor with patients. So they really do practice a very patient-centric kind of deployment and development paradigm within Mount Sinai. So I'm not going to go into mention the details in terms of what they deploy. They employ a lot of different methods. I'll talk about one in particular. But this is a team that is principally focused around deploying things directly into production at the institution. And they've actually deployed 5 total tools so far. I think a 6th one is coming online so far, very soon. These are in malnutrition, which I'll mention a little bit more detail, in fall prediction of delirium, in-hospital deterioration, as well as preventative, to some extent, discharge planning. And I use that only to say that if we can predict when someone is going to be discharged, we can get the wheels in motion to make sure that that happens on time. So I'm going to talk about malnutrition just very briefly, and I thank them for prompting this with some input from them. And I'll connect this to some of the work that we've been doing in my group in just a moment. But they take a very needs-driven approach, and they start really with patients, and they observe something specific about how malnutrition is not properly potentially handled in the health system. And so what they observe is that dietitians who go and to talk to patients and understand whether or not there's a nourishment issue will go and they look back historically at what the hit rate is for a dietitian to go and talk to a particular patient, maybe in a first in, first out kind of queue situation. That's going to come up a couple times here. And what they realize is that they're actually encountering a malnourished patient something on the order of 10% of the time. And so they looked at that and said, it's very likely that there are patients who are malnourished in the institution that we are not getting to. It's also very likely that our resources for our registered dietitians who are being deployed to the field to find patients and help them are not being optimally sent out or not being optimally optimized. This has operational impacts as well as financial impacts. I think those things go without saying. So what they did is they built a system to understand what the situation was, what their goal was, and then eventually, once they actually understood how they were going to do this, then they started to deploy artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies to build a machine learning engine that could push recommendations and reorder at the mid-level how registered dietitians are deployed throughout the health system and achieve the desired result, which is that we have more interaction with patients that are malnourished. So in a previous workflow, I think this is a little small actually on the screen, but ultimately you have an Epic list and you have registered dietitians that go and in a sort of random or first in, first out fashion to do a physical exam and re-input that data into Epic. In our case, what we'd like to see instead is something where we have some kind of predictive capacity to make sure that registered dietitians are going to those patients that have the maximum likelihood of having some kind of nourishment issue so that those resources are deployed as effectively as possible. And my point here really is just that actually the tools that have been leveraged are relatively simple compared to probably what a lot of you work on a regular basis if you're an engineer in this space. Relatively simple tools that are getting us 95% of the benefit, but are clearly deployable, right? And that can be integrated into our system very quickly. This is a random forest model on historical data, the gold standard historical data that they work in. And this was actually pushed out I believe last year, and then in 2 more hospitals in January of this year, and I think it's in 5 of our 8 major hospitals throughout New York City. And when they look historically back at that data, what they're seeing now is that 70% of the interactions between the dietitian and the patient are patients that need to see that dietitian that are malnourished, which is a pretty significant bump. So I run a group called Biodesign, and I'm going to skip over a few things in the interest of time about what the primary goals of the group are, but we are a needs-driven innovation group in medicine. We primarily work on medical devices with and without software. and that includes some of the work we do in artificial intelligence in the group AI Sinai, which I'll talk to you in a little bit. We follow a biodesign process, and that process is not too dissimilar from what I just described that the clinical operation teams leverages on a regular basis by understanding the need through a problem population outcome kind of structure, and critically not starting with a technology, but rather starting at the patient level. There's a lot of things that go into this, and a lot of stakeholders, many of whom are here today, who would be interested in the outcomes of these needs assessments, and the outcomes of these needs assessments specifically so that they can orient their technology development platforms to meet these specific needs. And this is actually what my group does on a regular basis, to some extent agnostic of the underlying technology. We work really carefully really closely with a group called AI Sinai, and as Paul nicely introduced me, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for this group, in collaboration with Eric Overman, who's a Chief Resident in Neurosurgery at Mount Sinai, and a mathematician by training, to try to find these gaps in the clinical workflow that we can affect with accessible and deployable machine learning technologies. And so we did a project last year and published this in Nature Medicine, where we took a look at acute neurologic events and tried to understand what we could do to ensure that those with truly emergent events, i.e. ischemic stroke that would ordinarily be triaged to the IR suite for a thrombectomy, for example, are seen as quickly as possible, and to reduce that time, as we know time is brain, and this was our goal. So we actually carried out a very classical biodesign analysis to understand where the opportunity for this is. And that comes with lots of interviews and a ton of involvement of the clinicians themselves in order to solve this problem. And so I'm not going to go through all of this is a schematic of how we wrote this out, and in the interest of time I won't go through all of it. But nonetheless, we do really try to backfill, or at least or first fill these kinds of questions when we think about how we're going to deploy a machine learning technology. So what we did actually was we built a 37,000 head CT database. At the time, I believe it was the largest in the world, though don't hold me to that. I'm sure someone can refute that. Along with their radiology reports, and built an NLP platform that annotated those radiology reports and binned them into emergent or non-emergent conditions. So for an example, a major finding on potentially a CT in the ER, given symptoms that are likely to suggest stroke, might be something that's not stroke at all, but a big tumor. And that's obviously a huge important event for in that person's life, but nonetheless not something that requires emergent triage to an IR suite for thrombectomy. And so we took a number of these different types of underlying conditions and binned those into emergent versus non-emergent conditions, and then used a convolutional neural network approach to classify incoming CTs as either emergent or non-emergent with some kind of risk score. We then took that and used it to reorder the work queue for radiologists. So instead of a standard FIFO queue, they're now looking at an emergently biased queue. And then we ran a prospective simulated control trial within the institution on simulated data, but prospectively, to show that we have an average reduction in the amount of time that it takes to actually triage that patient by something like 12 minutes upon presentation to the ED, which, if you consider that mortality in ischemic stroke goes for 10 to 90% over the first 4 hours, is a significant improvement for the health system. So I know we're going to discuss a lot of things today. I brought those two major examples up, those need-finding examples, as examples that are completely differently deployed and differently approached, but nonetheless are motivated by the need. And I know we're going to get to a lot of these things today, talking about the level of evidence and what that means for how generalizable our models are and localizability and what we think about data shift. We have tools that are deployed inside the institution that are deployed as QI, for example, as opposed to going externally and back into the institution through a commercial route. and all the regulatory structure that that induces. And I'm looking forward to talking about these, but I hope these two examples gave you a sense of two radically different types of approaches to needs finding that really induce a different structure on how we leverage institutional initiatives at Mount Sinai. There's a huge group of people, a lot of whom are radiologists and other clinicians who have contributed this to on the AI side. I have a team, this is the Biodesign group at Mount Sinai, and just to plug, we have a symposium in April next year, and we hope you come to it as well. Thanks very much for your time.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Chang up from UC Irvine. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Chang.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction and for inviting me here and all the organizers for this pretty interesting event. So my name is Peter. I am a neuroradiologist by training, and I in fact still practice about 1 day a week in the hospital. But what I've spent probably the last 10 years or so working on is actually on the technical side as a software engineer and data scientist for machine learning. Right? So it's kind of a unique background. In this time, I've sort of ended up working and collaborating with a number of industry partners, including a startup that I founded about 2 years ago. But despite all that, what I'm most interested in here, what I'm kind of going to focus my time on today, is my somewhat unique, near full-time role as director and technical lead of a new Center for AI in Diagnostic Medicine at UC Irvine. As you can read there, our vision is fairly broad, right, to develop and deploy a number of AI-based medical tools across our health system. So certainly a radiology focus given my background, but really quite broad. But aside from that, right, if you read that, your initial gut instinct might be to say, well, that's not really that different than pretty much a number of very similar initiatives that are all popping up around the country. So to sort of unpack that a little bit, what I want to spend some time thinking about is sort of starting from the beginning, right? So if you were to think, right, with a potential pot of money or a set of resources that you were wanting to set out and build an institutional center, right, what is exactly the role of that initiative, right? What are you trying to set out and do? And I will say, so if this group was just really myself or another team of PIs and engineers building algorithms, right, and writing papers, I would argue that that setup is not really that dissimilar from a number of very large labs across the country, right? So, so I thought about this for a while, and when I finally pitched my idea to the UCI leadership, what I settled on was actually a vision to compile a core that would essentially enable the community around me at large to engage in large-scale impactful work, right? Lower those barriers. And so what exactly does that look like? Well, as we know, right, projects start with ideas, but what makes our center a bit different is that almost all these ideas come from my collaborators and clinical colleagues in the hospital, right? Not myself. Many of these teams may in fact already be trying to use machine learning in some way in their work. What our job is to find those individuals and essentially streamline or remove those bottlenecks, right, such that more of their ideas and tools make it into clinical practice. And if I were to break down our primary tenets, our sort of pillars here, I would say for the most part they break down into these two categories, infrastructure and knowledge. And I'm going to go ahead and sort of talk a little bit more about those. So in terms of infrastructure, I think this part is a bit interesting. If somebody out here in the audience is looking to build a machine learning or deep learning network for the first time, or maybe some of you guys have already set out on this path, you might think that the most challenging and time-consuming part is where you sit down and wrestle with data and figure out what elegant model or architecture will give you the best results, right? That's sort of the default assumption. But in our world, in medicine, right, it turns out that we have to first solve all these other things before we even get to that model development part. Now, the great thing about this is that if you'll notice here in the little numeric breakdown in the corner, I estimate that probably 90% of this is actually quite reusable, which means that despite the significant hurdle to initially get your project off the ground, if you were to build that infrastructure properly, it could be reused for every other machine learning project you might be interested in. Right? So that was part of our central vision. Why not just figure out what these infrastructure pieces are and just build it once really well? Now, certainly with the time we have allotted, I'm not going to be able to go through this in detail, but suffice to say that the infrastructure is quite extensive, and it spans both sort of our research goals and sort of a dedicated research sandbox environment, as well as the clinical translational part, right? So once you have a tool that you're interested in deploying in the hospital, there's a whole nother sort of infrastructure and sphere that you need to tackle and solve. Nonetheless, we'll try to highlight a few of these key components. So the first thing I did when I got on campus about 18 months ago was actually to build a seamless and safe way to extract data from our PACS system and apply sort of the necessary anonymization requirements for our researchers. And what that has actually turned into is we've actually now adopted the role as imaging honest broker for an entire university. So anybody on campus that's looking to do imaging research, we have about a 2-day turnaround time where we can give you as much data as the IRB has cleared you to access. This has yielded a couple very large internal data sets. These numbers are actually about a year dated, so they're quite a bit larger than this. But suffice it to say, many tens of thousands of images of various types that have been digitized in the past 15 years in our hospital. Of course, once you actually get your hands on data, the next biggest bottleneck is trying to figure out how to annotate that enormous data set. And so what we've also developed is an in-house web-based annotation platform that's able to support global as well as pixel-level information, so segmentation masks and such. The web-based approach was useful because now the data no longer has to move to our individual collaborators, right? It sits centrally, and a number of our collaborators really across the state of California can all log in and sort of help us tackle and annotate that system. The other part I will point out is that the system is very tightly integrated into our workflow for actually developing algorithms, which means that we oftentimes use a very tightly coupled iterative approach where a series of weak labels are used for initial training, and then those training results are then reviewed by annotators and sort of back and forth to actually go through and annotate these otherwise, data sets that are too large to manually go through individually. Of course, as we also know, developing specifically deep learning algorithms on imaging or video data sets requires fairly specialized GPU hardware. And so we also went ahead and on day one purchased 20 GPUs spread out over 5 servers, as well as about 0.25 petabytes worth of archive storage, so enough to clone about a third of our PACS system. I will point out for those that are trying to put together a budget, this part is actually not extraordinarily expensive compared to the other costs you'll need to think about. Hardware nowadays is actually quite good and quite cheap thanks to our thanks to Bitcoin mining and gamers and such, right? So this part is actually not too hard to overcome. Now, the last part of the infrastructure I will point out is sort of our deployment sandbox. The idea was that both internally at our group and across multiple collaborators across the university, tools were being made, right, that seemed to work well in a sort of controlled bubble. So the next logical step was to deploy those algorithms. And because we started seeing the number of algorithms pile up very quickly, our vision was actually just to create a very generic API and sandbox such that if developers followed a set of standards, and we primarily essentially use Dockerized containers to let people bring in whatever they need, they can take those algorithms and deploy them in special servers we have behind the hospital firewall that's able to host these types of applications. All right, so that's sort of the infrastructure overview. Now, it does turn out that because most of the sort of latest and cutting-edge deep learning techniques are quite new, that even if the infrastructure is in place, right, you may not have a lot of people that are able to take advantage of it on day one because of the knowledge gap. So that's the other big part and big role of our center, is to educate and provide sort of the requisite knowledge to help people along. As you can see here, we have a number of offerings. I'm in fact, have a dual appointment in the Department of Computer Science, and I actually teach a class to develop deep learning applications for medical imaging. So, directly kind of into the hands of our undergrad and graduate students. I host a number of AI coding workshops, both locally and across the country at RSNA next week, actually, in fact, if some of you guys are attending. We actually launched our first medical AI hackathon in conjunction with the Department of Computer Science and School of Medicine. And then we also do journal clubs. So locally, there's a couple of other similar themed labs and centers in Southern California, so we sort of get together and try to have routine meetings. In addition to kind of reusable infrastructure and physical things, software, as we know, is also quite reusable. In fact, we noticed that for a lot of our common projects, a sort of uniform and template, if you will, pipeline was needed to process those images. This is the pipeline for brain imaging, as I'm sure some of you neuroimagers out there may recognize, but the same thing holds true for breast imaging, for prostate MRI, for RCC. So rather than having each research group reinvent the wheel and figure out how to do all this pre-processing, we essentially made available a number of mostly deep learning enabled tools to essentially get you straight to the end and sort of the interesting part, if you will, of the algorithm development process. And then finally, the actual model building part, as some of you may know, is getting quite a bit easier now with the great high-level libraries that are out there, but oftentimes it's useful to have a template, if you will, a library of sort of pre-built models and tools to help people get started. This is something that we've started to put together over about a year and a half, and I'm actually pretty excited to say we're going to be open sourcing a lot of this soon. So sort of keep posted for that. All right, so at this point, after I kind of start out with an overview, oftentimes I get asked a question, which is, so who's actually building all the algorithms, right? You've talked about infrastructure, you've talked about education, right? You've talked about a lot of nice support systems. So who's actually going to go out there and make tools? Well, I will say on day one, I thought that was going to be us. But in fact, you will quickly see if you build something like this that the demand far outstrips the supply of developers and data scientists that you as one sort of core can house. So we actually gradually shifted away from that model, and with enough sort of educational resources and other support resources available, our vision now is to actually try to enable everyone else in our community to get involved, right? Many of you guys actually out there, again, are probably already doing this type of work and don't need somebody to go out there and make the algorithms for you. You just want somebody else to handle and solve all the sort of more dry or uninteresting parts of a project. And so that's actually what I think, at the end of the day, properly funded and a properly resourced center should be able to do, is really to handle all those other infrastructure pieces that really a small lab may not be able to tackle on their own. And in an ideal situation, right, all the collaborators and the community developers will pick up the slack and essentially be the ones building tools. Now, I will end on this one slide, which is that, as you might imagine then, one of the most important things for the success of such a center or institution really is the ability to cross disciplines and to really work well with collaborators of all types. And I think this is important because if you were the person that was supposed to be the big AI machine learning expert making algorithms, right, it's very easy if you grow large enough to step on people's toes, right? And certainly in many places, the School of Medicine will start building something, and then the engineers will say, well, we've been doing this for 20 years. Like, what? Just because it's cool now, you guys want to get involved, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And it's true, right? Physicians are probably not, for the most part, well-equipped to be independently making algorithms. So I think, right, the right approach really, in fact, with a center like this, if you're doing the right things, is that you will now be offering a complementary sort of role, right? You're not actually going to be the one out there trying to steal other people's thunder, right? You're trying to make their jobs easier. You're trying to give them access to data, right? Give them access to tools for curating data. You're giving them ways to easily plug their latest and greatest new application into the hospital. You're really doing all these other things that enhance the community around you. So with that being said, that's all I've got for here. I think we have time for questions at the end, right? Or are we doing them? Okay, so we'll touch base on this again. But anyways, that's my contact information. We are welcome to work with anybody, not just people at our university, many projects across the country. So if you have anything in mind, feel free to reach out. And thank you for your attention.
Then finally, I'd like to invite Dr. Scott Zeger up. And here he is.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about something we call Johns Hopkins in health, and after the Obama administration, in health precision medicine. We have to keep current. This is an idea that emerged a decade ago. We had a new president in the university, and we decided to launch a $4.5 billion fundraising campaign, and decided for the first time in the history of Johns Hopkins to actually work together on a couple of problems. So I'm going to tell you the problem that was identified and the solution thus far as a way to lay some foundation for the conversation we're about to have. I'm going to talk a little bit about the American healthcare system, about learning at Johns Hopkins, and then about AI here. 10 years ago, when we were identifying problems the university might work on collectively, this one arose. What you see there is a picture of per capita medical expenditures for all of the OECD countries over time. And the difference between America, the most expensive, and the Netherlands, the second most expensive country in the world per capita, is the equivalent of $1 trillion of expenditures per year in the United States. So you might not think $1 trillion is too much. We heard Mary Ellen mention we need more NIH funding. There's $30 billion of NIH funding. And so actually $1 trillion a year is 30 additional NIHs each year. 30 NIHs each year. So we don't have to ask for a little bit more money. We could imagine capturing some of the $1 trillion of excess spending here relative to the rest of the developed world and try to reinvest that in the kinds of tools we're discussing today. I know what you're thinking is that, yeah, but for an extra trillion, we must, do a lot better than the rest of the world. And that's, you could take any medical statistic that you want, life expectancy conditional on making it to 65, almost any measure, and we tend to run with Turkey and Poland and Estonia and others like that out of the competition with the rest of the developed world. So there's been a lot of research about what happens to this $1 trillion, and about a third of it goes to the poor use, the unintelligent use of evidence and information in decisions about medical practice. So what I want to talk about today is what Johns Hopkins decided to do a decade ago to become part of the solution to this problem, not just part of the problem. I like to think of this as a big data problem for those of you who are big data people. We asked the question back then, how can intelligence be used to improve the practice of medicine at Johns Hopkins and also in America to create better health outcomes at more affordable costs? And so today we want to talk a little bit about the role for AI. And really what I want to do in my few minutes is just lay the bigger contextual picture because I think a lot of what we decide to do with AI is only going to be meaningful if it's part of the solution to this problem. So, in healthcare, people like to talk about the learning healthcare system, and this little, if you Google learning healthcare, you'll get something that looks like this, with patient care at the pinnacle. Patient care generates information data. The data is used to improve our knowledge about the problem, and we return that knowledge to improve care for patients. And I thought Mary Ellen's talk was an elegant illustration of more than 2 decades of work in a particular area of medicine. So let's use this as the paradigm. There's the notion that we should somehow lay this down on top of a major medical center like our own, and that would solve the problem. We'd become part of the solution, not part of the problem. One of the things you find quickly is that to sort of learn in healthcare, you have to focus on a particular area of healthcare. In fact, healthcare is a whole set of different trades and different lines of business. We heard about a couple of them already today, particularly most of them in imaging, but you could have the same sorts of approach to many different areas. And in fact, if you take a health system like ours, we have about 100 lines of business, each of which has to learn how to use information more intelligently. And so what we decided early on was to choose a few of them, but then to actually work on the infrastructure necessary to scale what we learn how to do in some of these leading clinics in order to improve health outcomes at more affordable costs across Johns Hopkins Medicine. And our APL colleagues like to call this a learning system of systems rather than just a learning healthcare system. So the first question is, what does the infrastructure have to look like in order to enable learning? And you would think it's largely the technical issues of which AI is part of, is one of them, but in fact what it is first and foremost is a vision for the future from the leadership. At Johns Hopkins, our leaders are running a $9 billion operation. It's like flying a 777 across the ocean, and then you come along and say, oh, by the way, we need to start learning how to learn to drive out about the 30% of waste and to actually improve outcomes. You need people to say, yeah, we're willing to take on that problem, and we're fortunate at Hopkins to have such leadership. You then need the science-driven healthcare tools that we've been hearing about and we'll be talking about more here today. But the other 2 things I want to point out to you is that without a changed bioethical framework, there's no opportunity for success. You have to change from the tradition of separating research from patient care and to be able to actually learn in the process of patient care. And we are trying to move towards a new framework which says it's unethical to not learn in the practice of medicine. And if you take that perspective rather than it's only ethical to do research and then to bring research into industry and then buy back what you did into your organization, I think it's going to take too long. And in that end, you need a new business model. You need to return the savings and the resources to the people who are generating improved outcomes at a more affordable cost rather than paying more for doing more, which has been our tradition. So let me focus in on the science-driven healthcare and what we're doing in that particular area, but I want to emphasize that it is a part of the bigger solution. It's not the driver of the solution. And so in this area, Hopkins is a highly decentralized organization. We have, our last list has 300 MD, PhD data scientists across all of the organization working on healthcare. We have strong groups of people working in particular areas of healthcare. I've listed some of them there. But we also have a very strong philosophy here of letting everybody do whatever they want. And I found this quote from Mao Zedong, letting 100 flowers bloom. If you remember, George Bush, who came after him, was 1,000 flowers. But Mao said in 1956, 100 flowers in order for the flourishing of the arts and the progress of science. I will remind you that it wasn't about 3 years later that the Cultural Revolution started, and he gave up on this perspective. So I have no comments to make about what's going to happen in the future of AI and healthcare, but just keep it in mind that we have, like most of you, many different projects happening all over the place in totally disorganized ways. So what we have done in terms of infrastructure is we've tried to build a model which is really the learning healthcare practice. And so we spent about $600 million on a new EHR over the last decade. And now what we have done is we have taken all of the data we generate from our electronic health record, we move it to the cloud every single night. We integrate with that data all of the research data that's relevant to a particular one of those virtuous learning circles, and we then project back every day a clinical cohort database which is specific to a particular area of medical practice. And that's what we call the precision medicine analytics platform that does that work. And now what we're doing is shifting our effort to build what our leadership has called the Insight Engine. This is a tool for in the Epic workflow to visualize all of the data that is returned back to the cloud, and then to be able to build the models to identify what the person's health state is, what their health state trajectory is, which subset of patients they are a part of, and to predict what the likely benefits of the competing interventions would be for every one of our patients. We then take that information and we try to then add a value proposition. We have models that we're building around how much value is being added by clinical decisions and or by health system decisions that then obviously will change practice. So at the top there are called centers of excellence. We have 17 of them now. 4 or 5 of them are mature, and we're going to have 30 next year. And then the goal would be to make this a routine part of what we do at Johns Hopkins Medicine. I wanted to make a little bit of a comment about all of the AI work that's going on in different places. So with respect to that, we're hoping to have what I would call a rubber band that wraps around all of the centers that are working on AI, and that is elastic so that they can go in directions that otherwise we wouldn't imagine, but which keeps them trying to generate things that can plug into this system-wide solution. So they're going to, like an amoeba, move in different directions, but by controlling the access to data and by being able to scale what they do, we're hoping to be able to change the system. So I want to make just 2 comments about the kinds of things we do in AI and the areas where it has a big impact. And I've put at the top the things like we heard in the plenary talk from Mary Ellen, where there's a specific problem and whereby improving the practice of medicine using tools that solve that problem, you can actually make big steps forward. But the point is that it's something that can be done by a lab at the level of a lab that has talented people that are committed over long periods of time to solving those problems. And we have a lot of that going on here, as at many organizations, and we have to really prioritize translating what they do back into patient care. But it's really routed outside of the institution through the FDA, and it comes back. But if you look at the practice of medicine every day at an organization like ours, the big waste is in not having access to the information that you need, the clinicians having access to the information they need in an organized way with the appropriate kinds of models that would help them organize their thinking and make better decisions. And so that's the stuff that I've really represented down at the bottom. It's really changing the way medicine is practiced, one specific area at a time, but also changing the milieu. And if you think about what happens today, we have an electronic health record. It generates transactional information. We have pipes that flow out throughout the organization, and everybody can see all the transactions they're entitled to see, but we don't have a good way to add meaning to that plethora of information about transactions, or to evaluate those transactions for the patient at hand in light of the experience with all the patients that came before, and in light of the scientific knowledge that exists in that area. So what this system we're talking about is doing is to add to the transactional system meaning and measures of value, one clinic at a time. So how do we decide which clinics and what do we actually do? My colleagues have already spoken to this. I just want to say that AI is a part of it, but identifying the right need is the most important thing. Being able to access and acquire high-quality information relative to addressing that need, building the kinds of information tools we'll be talking about all of the time, and then figuring out how to assure that the tools that we have are worth putting back into the patient care. Sometimes that can be done through the FDA. I think it's a minor fraction of the tools that ultimately will pass through the FDA, and I would love for us to have a conversation about all the rest of what happens in the practice of medicine. And it's not sufficient to evaluate the tool and say, yes, I want to present this back in the workflow to clinicians here or elsewhere, but you also have to curate such a system if you're doing it. You can't just do it and then hope that it stays right. We heard that from Mary Ellen this morning. And then the question is how to scale it so that you can do better than you would be able to do at your own institution or at a small group of institutions. I'm going to skip this. Let me just make a summary of the main points once again. America is a crisis if you haven't been paying attention. And one of the main contributors to that crisis is the fact that the bottom 80% of the American workforce hasn't had a real raise in terms of real dollars in the last 40 years. It's not that their employers aren't paying more money to employ them. They are paying more money, but that money is going into out-of-control costs in healthcare and in higher education, the two places that continue to grow at very high rates. And there's $1 trillion of waste in the system. A big chunk of it is because we're not using information technologies in a meaningful way. So what we want to do, and I think medicine as a profession needs to do, is to think about how to learn one clinic at a time, but how to change then the infrastructure in each of our major health centers to be able to make decisions, the millions of decisions we make every day, well informed by the relevant information. And at Hopkins, we're doing that with three components, so-called centers of excellence, these 17 that we have now, the ones that we're going to eventually scale across all of our clinics, by having an analytics platform that is a complement to the transactional flow of information that allows meaning and value to flow, and then to be quantifying that value on a regular basis so that we know how to change our system. As I said, we have AI throughout the organization in many important areas, and there remain many hurdles. The rubber band is stretched. We don't want it to break, and we need a business model to actually, when we have wins of better outcomes at more affordable costs, that the money that's saved goes to the people who did that, or at least some of it, so that we can do more of it. Thanks very much.
All right, now we'll move on to our panel. So I'd like to ask our panelists, please have a seat. You'll find microphones there. So we'll start out with some questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor to the audience. To start off, I think that we've had some three amazing talks. We've heard of a lot of different perspectives and perhaps flavors of institutional AI initiatives. So I'd like to ask the panelists, in your own words, what's the value proposition of an institutional AI initiative? And related to that, what does that allow or facilitate that might not otherwise happen organically?
We can just go down the line. So thanks for the question. So I was trying to integrate in my head things that all three of us said, and what occurred to me, at least initially, is that everyone talked about enablement in some way. You talked about bringing down, you put infrastructure in place that enables you to bring down the effort and cost for people to get into the clinic by establishing things that are, reusable. I mean, spoken like a true software engineer. And I was interested, you just got in talking about how you have routes that traditionally, where we think about, they go out of the health system and they come back in, but then there are all of these routes that potentially are not particularly well served right now that stay more and more close to the health system throughout the entire amount of time. So to me, if I'm thinking about, our own initiatives and the contrast and the examples that I gave, sort of this hierarchical or multi-scale enablement where all of these pieces are connected in one way or another, seem to me maybe the most important thing we can do in these kinds of initiatives.
I would build on that just briefly by saying, or rather perhaps emphasizing the need for sort of this enablement across multiple levels, right? So the algorithm development part, again, is just one minor piece of the puzzle. I can't emphasize how important leadership was in our particular institution, right? Like, the things I'm proposing are not grant fundable things that you'll get paid for to do, so we need money from the institution to actually do that, and that's something that's, leadership has to get on board with that, because if they're expecting your center to be self-funded in 3 years or 5 years or something like that, then I think you're not going to get very far. So.
Hello? Yeah. So, I agree with both of my colleagues, and I would just say that the ultimate measure is got to be patient outcomes and the cost, the value of the care that was provided to those patients. And it's actually, there are many people who are students of this, of quantifying value, lots of important work there. How to get that into the leadership of health institutions like our own, so that proper assessments of what's valuable, these kinds of tools that we're talking about, how valuable they are, can be made and then invested in, because there is a return on investment given the waste that exists in the system.
Yeah, and so given that there's clearly a value proposition here, and we've discussed the varying levels of how there are already perhaps overlapping initiatives already, maybe concurrently or in the past, how do you best integrate such an institutional AI initiative with pre-existing efforts, with things that might be going on with other departments or even schools at the university? And related to that, how do you scale that up in a way that might be harmonious or synergistic?
I think that's an interesting question. I think scale is an interesting thing to talk about. I might leave that for a second. I think, and Scott mentioned in his talk the fact that, Johns Hopkins has a strong tradition of letting anyone do whatever they want. I would agree with that at Mount Sinai as well. And being all things to all people is not an easy thing to do, and at the same time, finding ways to prioritize efforts that have value for the institution is not an easy thing to do either. And so, I think that a top-down approach is unlikely to be successful. And that's why I liked both of my colleagues' examples of things that they have done to resource groups, but still provide a soft touch direction to have an impact. And that being done at multiple levels. I mean, to some extent it's repeating the last question, but I think that's true. I think scale is, how do you scale that up? I mean, when I think about things that we can do to have impact inside the institution without necessarily going on an external route and moving that technology back into to Mount Sinai, I think about the underlying technology itself. And I think when we say scale, to some extent we also talk about how do we generalize this tool. And that becomes a difficult thing to do without a lot of other people indexing into that and providing their feedback, and also expanding the scope and the span of the data space. So I mean, I think things scale together, I guess, is what I really mean by that.
Yeah, I'll actually tackle it in reverse, because I want to build something on what you just said about scale. So I actually think that's a critical piece of a lot of what we're trying to do here, right? The whole point of an institutionalized center is so that individual labs are not just working in isolation and right, not sharing any resources. And to that extent, our center is essentially the model now that's being expanded upon across the other 5 UC hospitals, essentially academic hospitals, with the vision. They saw, well, you've already done X, Y, Z. Why are we going to go and rebuild the exact same things 5 times, right? There's no point in doing that. And if everyone shares sort of the same infrastructure, same data extraction systems, well, now there's no reason that all of our papers now shouldn't have large 50,000, 100,000 patient cohorts, because that's what we have in California, right? We're all part of the same UC umbrella. There's no reason that shouldn't be the case. So scale, I think, is certainly a very important part of the picture. Back to the initial question, which I think was focused more about how do you how do you not butt heads, right, and how do you coordinate efforts? Well, I'll say the first thing I did when we started was I actually sat down with all the key sort of leadership in the different departments, and I asked them point blank, what would you want, right? I already know you guys are doing X, Y, Z, that's excellent, but what would you want? And to bring it back to finances, I actually asked them, well, would you be willing to pay for that if I built it? And for example, data extraction was a key bottleneck. They said, yes, engineers in our institution have been getting data from every other hospital in the world except our own. So I said, well, I'll build this service. It's going to cost a little bit of money, but if I made it, X number of dollars per study or per batch, would that be something that's okay? And they said yes. So that's what I think you need to do. You really need to go to someone and just ask them, is this something that's going to be useful?
There's two ways to scale. There's scaling across more patients of a particular kind, but there's also scaling across related disciplines in the practice of medicine. And I think how to scale vertically is, I think, clear. There's obstacles, but it's clear how to do it. And having a company that sells something is a very good way. How to scale across related information problems is much more interesting, I think. And so that's something we're trying to tackle now. And I hope that in a year's time, we'll be able to report back that, in about a week, we can take a clinic that has the data projections available to it, but previously was just practicing medicine as before. And in a week's time, our engineers could come in and have a first version of an well-informed decision process that uses the relevant data and has it in front of patients and clinicians in a test mode. And that we would have a system for over the next year determining whether this adds value or not, and then automate that system. So to me, that's really the holy grail. It's not the kind of thing that gets done very often, I think, in academic centers, because the drive in an academic center is for smaller groups of people to solve a particular problem and to be able to publish about it. This is more like a systems-wide engineering thing, and I hope we're able to make some progress, but I'm sort of guessing that a lot of progress will come from the right company at the right time.
And kind of shifting gears a little bit, one of the most exciting parts about AI in healthcare to me is this intersection of the tech world and medicine. So we know that in Anthony's work, he's worked with Verily, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet Incorporated. We've even seen partnerships moving to FDA products. UCSF has co-developed a pneumothorax detector which actually lives in an X-ray machine. And so my question to the panelists is, in your view, what is the optimal relationship between industry and academic institutions and initiatives towards bringing AI from bench to bedside? Or maybe you don't know the answer, but maybe any insight.
I definitely don't know the answer with any, but I think to some extent it depends. I gave two examples in my presentation about something that was clearly scalable to some extent within our health system vertically, in very specific domains, where we were sufficiently localized and nimble to be able to do that within the health system. To your previous question, as you scale the other direction, then, and I thought that was nicely put, then all of a sudden it's very difficult to do that without moving a technology outside of the health system first and then bringing it back in. And so I think the decision point of where that relationship sits is a really hard thing to get right. And different groups obviously do it different ways because they have experience and a history of either deploying internal or serving as an academic research group, which is certainly how we started solving very particular problems. I think it's about identifying that decision point.
Well, I guess I would say that academic centers and our industry partners have very different strengths, right? So in an academic setting, you have access to data and experts, right? You have people that know what's important. You have access to also a test bed, right? When you have a new idea, we can flip a switch and turn it on immediately, which is something most companies will not have access to. Now, when you're actually going to commercialize the product, right, when you're thinking about the FDA approval process or regulatory approval process outside the U.S., right, these are things that hospitals may not have a lot of experience with and, quite frankly, could benefit strongly from industry partnerships. So I would say there is actually, in my mind, a reasonable synergy. Now, the other point I'll also say is that traditionally that synergy has not existed, right? So we tend to be very fearful in academia about what happens when you sort of cross that line and start thinking about commercialization. And I will say traditionally the barriers are so significant that a lot of technology is just lost. I will say my experience, so in addition to some of my other partners, I also have a startup company, and you know, part of my push and my rationale all along really was, right, like somebody's going to go out there and do this. There's multiple people all working on it. The people that are most successful are going to be the ones that have sort of the least barrier to resistance. And I think, you know, at our institution, I won't go into details, but they were very flexible, right? That's what it came down to. Like, you know, they understood that if the company is successful and you're successful, like that's all going to trickle down. Eventually everyone will be successful in the process. So maybe, you know, reevaluate some of our more traditional ways of approaching these relationships and being kind of creative and being maybe aggressive, I think is my mind the right move.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to make one comment, which I think is interesting. I mean, if you look at, we were in the Biodesign group, we work a lot in devices, and in those, you know, a lot more of the pathway is it's a little more obvious, right? It's a little more traditional, and we sort of know how that goes, and so we know, you know, when the technology leaves, when it comes back, and what people are good at. You know, we're not going to do the regulatory work, obviously, in our group. We're not going to function as a CMO. We're not going to function as all of these parties where industry players have all of the relationships and all of the expertise, and in our case, all the engineering needed to bring these products to fruition. I'm obviously leaving a lot of components of that out in that discussion. I mean, in software, though, and in AI in particular, I'm not sure that we know yet exactly where those boundaries are. I mean, I think that we're trying to figure that out. I think it's becoming somewhat more clear with time, but it's not just data versus engineers, or you know, it's just not that clear cut anymore. And as we build institutional initiatives, those barriers will continue, to me, to break down a bit. And I think each institution is going to find their strength in what that, you know, collaborative relationship looks like.
And before we open up the floor to the audience, I want to offer the panelists an opportunity if you have any questions that you've been wanting to ask the others, or maybe something that came up. If not, no problem, no harm, no foul. All right, so at this point I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. I would request that you go to the microphones on either side of the aisle for those who are webcasting the symposium.
Great discussion, thank you. I was wondering, there's a part of this cycle that I think is worth highlighting. So one of Scott's comments about bringing the engineers to the clinic and getting visualizations into the hands of the clinicians, I think illustrates this. I think EHR data are famously sparse and messy for a variety of reasons, but a big part of them is that they're a technologic dead end. I'll use an example. We used to have an electronic patient record where the medication lists were put in and they were populated every time someone was discharged, every time a medication was changed, they were supposed to be updated. But you couldn't generate a script from that medication list. Those lists were horrible. The quality was terrible because they didn't operate anywhere downstream. I think when clinicians start seeing visualizations of data and begin seeing augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence driven by the data, the way the data are registered and the quality of those data will change. And I was wondering how you anticipate, because you'll build the system for one quality and there's going to be a Hawthorne effect as the data become operable. They'll also improve in quality, and I was wondering whether you've anticipated those things.
I think you made a very important point. The quality of data depends on how much it's used. The more it's used, the better it becomes. And we're seeing that in our centers of excellence. I mean, the first thing that happens is when you project to them their data, their patients, they say how bad it is, you know. And so we say, well, what are you going to do to make it better? And they immediately start coming to your team and people around the IT world at Hopkins and say, I need this, I need that. And so you do your best to help them improve their own situation. And as we begin to make, this happened in our prostate, in our urology program, as soon as we started making predictions about the probability a tumor was aggressive or versus indolent, they started disagreeing with some of the predictions. So then they say, well, why do you disagree? Well, because of the following reasons. Well, that's not what the data say, and so then you begin the kinds of conversations that are essential. Let me say one other thing, that there's a view out there that as soon as we get this new data, this omics data or that new imaging technology, that somehow it'll all become clear. And one of the things that our committee that started a while back thinking about these issues came to recognize immediately is the best way to get ready for all that new data that's going to be coming is to use the data you have right now in a meaningful way, right? Don't make a waste of it and then expect somehow the new data is going to make it better.
I want to just briefly add, I think Mary Ellen had a great slide this morning about continuous learning. I think your comment essentially highlights even more the importance and need for such a system. I will point out that currently our version 1 of a lot of our tools and algorithms out there virtually never do that, right? There's not even a good FDA clearance pathway for that right now. I know Berkman's up there, I see him. He'll probably comment on it more, but right, it's a limitation, and it's something that I think we definitely need to account for in the coming years.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to bring up an elephant in the room that hasn't been mentioned yet, the critical need for strong cybersecurity. Comments, please.
So this is a very important comment, and you saw the news stories a week ago with the Google partnership. People are very concerned about privacy in the medical space, especially. What's interesting, though, is that the system that we've built that wraps around Epic takes data from Epic and puts it in the cloud. By definition, is going to be much safer than the systems that we run ourselves. And our IRB and our Data Trust, which are very conservative organizations, we're probably as conservative as any medical center, they have now given permissions, having considered all the risks, for us to move data more quickly to the cloud. It used to be that you had to individually go through lots of hoops to be able to get access to the data to learn from it, and now it's becoming automated as a result of these technologies. So while I agree with you that security is an issue, by actually having systems that are secure rather than trusting individuals, we can make progress a lot more rapidly.
Just a brief comment on that. We're a little bit earlier in the process than I think you guys are, but nonetheless, we're in the process of enabling cloud and other kinds of resources like that as a single sort of pane of glass, precisely for the same reasons, but we're also doing it at the level of individual research groups under BEA, for example, under a big org, under a big agreement. And I do think ultimately that leads to enhanced security on the part of the research work that we do.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions, so any last minute folks?
Scott and all of you that had an excellent presentation. For Scott, some of these projects that Hopkins is doing, I came to know for the first time. How do we disseminate this information to everyone so they can be part of the process to accept the new tools and use it more effectively?
I knew there'd be somebody who knew the reality of the situation here, but scaling horizontally is the challenge, and it can't happen fast enough until the reward system changes. When the chiefs go to meet with the business leaders and they review the RVUs and they split up the money based upon how much of certain kinds of care is done, there really are no financial incentives for the individual divisions and departments to change how they practice. If, in addition to that old way of measuring, we now measure based upon value added that is quantified through the system we're talking about, I think the game will change, because there's enough waste that as you reduce the waste, improve the value, there's money to be spent to do more of it. And that's where I hope we get to. So when you go to your meetings and they ask you about your RVUs, ask them where's the value measure.
And I think we have time for one more. I think I saw just one more.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. I noticed, Dr. Zeger, that you didn't answer the question earlier about the relationship with the industry. I know strong relationship with strong infrastructure in New York and Southern California, but what do you see the role of industry in the Baltimore region, the collaboration with the Hopkins is within this initiative? And that's my first question. If I may, I have another question regarding to the answer that the other panelists gave. So please clarify this. My take was that the role that you see for the industry to collaborate with the institutions is more of a contract and not that much of a collaboration. You want to contract out the FDA approval process or the hardware development process, and not that much of a development. Please correct me if I got that wrong. Thank you.
So let me make two quick comments. So if as an industry representative you're worried about these academic health centers wanting to just contract out and not treat you as full partners, let me just tell you a quick vision that might encourage you. I imagine that the tech world will become the accumulators of the health industry. And by that I mean the people who accumulate the healthy people to start and ultimately have control of the patients in the future, right? And they'll be coming to places like our institutions offering us the opportunity to provide specific medical services to the people they represent at costs that they establish based upon their value models and their AI-driven technologies, and they'll be holding us to having AI standards that they establish rather than the ones that we establish. So that is one way the future might go, especially if academic health centers don't accelerate the rate at which they transform themselves. That's the first thing I'd like to say. And then the second thing is, I think the best opportunity is one that we tried to sell at our own institution a decade ago, and not with much success, but there are others thinking in these terms, which is to take a captive audience where there's an expensive cost to an organization. So for example, at Hopkins, we're spending someplace between $800 million and $1 billion a year on healthcare for our employee plan. We spend that money, we spend some of it with our own doctors, but a lot of it with other doctors, right? So imagine a company being formed, the purpose of which is to create better health outcomes at more affordable costs through the kinds of techniques we're talking about, and achieving profitability through reducing the waste. I think that's a huge opportunity for companies, whether they be existing companies or future companies. And I know we've met in the process of researching this, lots of payers who are looking for those kinds of companies who can actually deliver. And it's going to take a whole new kind of innovative approach to creating entities of which the members, the providers, and the payers are all a part of the organization, and they all win when you get better health outcomes at more affordable costs and drive the kinds of innovations that we heard about here this morning.
So, if I may, so is that framework in place for the institution in Hopkins to work with these startups?
No.
Thank you.
So I can comment a little bit more on the specific relationships perhaps that you might be wondering about, and maybe the part where people build models and sell them, right? I think that's sort of maybe the more salient example. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I actually don't think that companies in the future will be the ones primarily building algorithms. And the reason is, if you take a look at any of the open challenges that we tend to host, the RSNA, for example, or SIM, or the others, anytime a large data set is released to the world, the winners of that competition are never the expected players, the guys from big companies or even a big academic institution. They're usually like some high schooler in Belarus or something, right? In Europe. It's just completely unexpected. But that's because the democratization of the tools now make it such that, right, it's an empiric field of study. Whoever tries the most interesting and clever and unique things, one of them tends to be the best. So I think it's hard to expect any single one company to ever be sort of the go-to with this latest, greatest state-of-the-art every single day, every day of the year, right? That seems unlikely. So I imagine that with all the academic centers out in the world and the people that have the data and all the experts, I think, right, we're the ones that will probably be the generating algorithms, generating tools, generating ideas. I think we'll still need people and companies that figure out how to make sure those tools reach all the right customers and kind of make it to clinical deployment, perhaps to help in regulatory processes, for example, or to help with validation. Maybe you need, your tool works here, but now I have to test it at 10 hospitals. Who's going to help me do that, right? So I think there's actually quite a bit of opportunity for all those other things that need to happen after the tool's been made. And I imagine some sort of synergy there to exist in the future.
I know we're out of time, so I just want to make one comment, and this has been actually in the sort of zeitgeist in the last 3 or 4 months as well, is that, winning, for example, CAGLE competitions is not the same thing as optimizing for, your patient outcome in a particular area. And I think that, so the only comment that I have about that is just simply that I agree ultimately that I don't think those companies are going to be the ones deploying the algorithms, but I think our role, even on the non-technical side, should be to shape those kinds of things so that the outcomes of those competitions, whatever they happen to be, these technical innovations, are prioritized in a way that actually impacts our clinical outcomes.
All right, so that concludes our panel. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers.